coming on a Friday afternoon, taking time to come be in the, I don't know, student seat again. And that's really, so this is an ongoing series. I just want to introduce you to the series in hopes that you'll come back for these and look out for them. And it's really an ongoing series to let faculty share their expertise and for the rest of us to get to be in the student seat again. I think as a part of the Broward College community, you probably are a lifetime learner, and you probably, if you're like me, miss being in the student seat. And so it's fun to get to do that again. And yeah, so I also just want to turn it over now to Shane to give a little bit more introduction. But before I turn it over, I also just wanted to highlight him. He's really done everything to put this together and connected with the Alumni Association, and really he deserves all the credit for this. So thank you so much, Shane, and I will turn it over to you.
It's truly an honor that we have all of you who took time out of your busy schedules to be here with us for this web conference. And this is a series. This is the third one that we've done. And we hope to build bridges across the disciplines, across all of our school campuses. And I want to just highlight some of the best and brightest scholars that are in our pathway. That's so important that we do every once in a while. And we hope to build on this faculty speaker series into a showcase so that our pathway can have a convincing pedagogical vision for the society. I wanted to also thank quite a few people. Let me just run through it pretty fast. Of course, Haley Mathis is the co-chair of the faculty series, and thank you so much for all the hard work you did. I also wanted to thank Jill Horowitz, the Alumni Engagement Officer, who's with the Alumni and Friends group, who helped me learn so much about marketing and to promote this event and create the images and so forth. So she's been so helpful. I appreciate it. Dr. Sanem Beaton Garcia and Dr. Stefan Denevent have helped publicize this event and sent out to their email groups to get all of you invited. And I wanted to thank William Miller, the Dean of Academic Affairs for our AHCD pathway. I wanted to thank Jamonica Roll, the Dean of the Communication part of the pathway, Dr. Julia Filia and the staff of CTEL for providing professional development credit and helping us schedule this event. Akeem Barfield is the lead specialist from Campus Technology, who's here with us today. Thank you so much for training me on how to do this. And Harold Bilbao, who's also with that same department in audiovisual, who helped. The associate deans are very important to the pathway and to all of our lives. So let me go through their names real quick. Ed Cornejo, Michelle Jackson, Ariana Bianchi, Amoy Reed, Priscilla Suarez, Brittany Roberts, Jamie Martin, Daniela Wancier. Some of you are actually here today, and that's terrific, supporting the pathway and getting to know each other better. So there's going to be Q&A, but the speakers want to do this a little bit different. So our first speaker, you can actually ask the questions while they're speaking, and I'm going to moderate it, and then I will either interrupt him and ask the question, or I'll let you do it on camera at certain points. He's going to show a PowerPoint presentation, so there'll be times when he won't want to go to the next slide if we're going to ask a question regarding one of the slides. Our first speaker will grapple with some of the historical events and policies that have been the cause of several communities' mistrust of the medical community. His razor-sharp mind and his continuing concern about the vaccine and about the skepticism involving the vaccine and also medical experimentation is something that he's going to share with us today. This speaker has a substantial record of achievement, a keen understanding of academics. He's earned the reputation of honesty, integrity, ethical conduct. We're so glad to have him as our Associate Dean. He's a New York City native. He brings with him a broad cultural and ethnic perspective that has allowed him to incorporate history and historical paradigms into the most basic of important socio-political conversations. He's currently serving as our Associate Dean of the South Campus, Arts, Communication, Humanities, and Design pathway. And during his time at Broward College, he's been a professor of history, psychology, the fundamentals of humanities. He holds an MA in counseling, psychology, and a PhD focusing on the social history of medicine in the US and in Latin America. His research interests have focused on social and political responses to pandemics, very timely, most specifically the plague. But he's also worked on how societies view the concepts of health, illness, and the perception of disease. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Dr. Ed Cornejo for his talk on the ugly truth underlying medical mistrust.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunderson. Thank you, Dr. Mathis. What a pleasure it is to work with you guys. I remember when we first started talking about these faculty speaker series, we started small, and I can't wait till we start to incorporate the other pathways and start learning math and science and nursing and all these other things in order to really build a nice academic community here at BC. Who would have thought, and thank you, Shane, for that introduction. Like 3/4 of that is not what I sent you, but thank you. So, but who would have thought that 10 years after I received my PhD in the history of medicine, that we'd be in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so I find myself in the position where everything I have studied all of a sudden makes sense, right? And what a lucky position that is for me. And so today, I want to take the opportunity to really talk about something that is obviously in the news, that we academics talk about. For those of us who have already gotten vaccinated, maybe it's not a question for us, but we do wonder why other people might not, et cetera. And a lot of it has to do with the history of medicine, right? And that being said, what I wanted to do is kind of touch base with this idea, right, of what we're going to be talking about. And today, in the social history of medicine regarding pandemics, regarding medical mistrust, regarding the fear to vaccinate or not, or the question to vaccinate or not, I'm thinking about focusing today's discussion on what you see here on the screen, the basic facts, some very, very basic statistics. I don't want to go too heavily into this, to give you time all to ask questions, to elaborate, to help allow me to elaborate on points, to help guide you, and you maybe will teach me a little something. Why we bother with history in the first place? You know, why has nobody really talked about the social history of medicine when it's probably the one discipline that has been able to incorporate not just pandemic studies and disease studies, but health studies and philosophy and science and the role of nurses and the role of medical officers, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit about what specifically the social history of medicine is. We'll talk a little bit about the blame game, which I think is a very important part to all pandemics. Medical experimentation, some lessons learned, and the challenges for today's thinkers, whether they be academics, whether they be professors, or whether they be students. It doesn't really make a difference, but I think it's really important to kind of end today with some basic questions, right? And with that in mind, I want to discuss some of the very basics in terms of statistics. Some of this might be shocking, some of this might be surprising, some of this might not be. But Laura Bogart in the year 2019 had initiated a study throughout the United States, and she found that the majority of marginalized populations, those people who are outside the majority, for those people who are the oppressed, the poor, the immigrant, the people who come from that history of American slavery, African Americans, as indigenous people, women, all of these marginalized populations are greatly affected by medical disparities. They don't get the health, they don't receive the health care that the majority receives. And because of that, they exhibit high levels of medical mistrust. And for those of us who are privileged, right, we sometimes don't understand where that mistrust comes from. And so Laura Bogart in this study basically questions where this is coming from, why it is, who's doing the mistrusting, and trying to figure out the statistics. This whole conversation that I'm having today with you is a continuation of a presentation I did back in April of last year, I think it was, for the Department of Health for the state of Florida. And they wanted me to focus on HIV. They wanted me to focus on HIV treatment and how to work with social workers and human services professionals to deal with populations that don't exactly trust medical officers or help. And much of this mistrust that Bogart discusses in her article is focused on conspiracy beliefs. This idea that something's got to be wrong, something the government is doing is treating us badly and not giving us the public health needs, satisfying our public health needs, not giving us the resources that we need, has to be intentional, has to be politically driven, has to be somehow designed by the government powers that be. In that specific article, and just to give you one example of many, in the case of HIV, and this is 2019, 48% of the African Americans that she interviewed believed that the HIV virus was created specifically by the government for a variety of purposes, right? To limit population growth, to exterminate an entire race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, etc. 48%, pretty high. 53% of African Americans and other marginalized people believe that there is a cure to HIV, but that, listen to this, it is being withheld from the poor. That those who are privileged, those who have money, those who are in positions of power, those who fit into that image of what America is supposed to be, have already received it, a vaccine, or have already been treated, or get the medical resources that are required. And so Bogart believes, and I agree with her, that this medical mistrust has been proposed as a contributor to all of the disparities. And it's absolutely true, right? But where does this mistrust come from? And why do we bother with mistrust when we're in the 21st century, right? We know so much more about medicine. We know so much more about bacteria and germs and viruses, et cetera. But an interesting factor, and my students who are online probably have already heard this from me, but all of this knowledge that we have is only about 150 years old. For comparison's sake, consider the following. We've been Homo sapiens sapiens for 20,000 years or more. We have lived in cities for the last 5,000 years, right? But we've only discovered the microscopic or the bacteriological world in the 1860s. So for almost 19,500 years, we had no clue that there was this microscopic world that really is the zenith of evolution, that is the zenith of creation. We are its food, we are its victims. We are the ones that are most affected by bacteria, viruses, and germs. And so this bacteriological revolution has completely changed the way we think. And it is what caused Charles Rosenberg, a famous historian and the very first historian of medicine in the United States and in the world, to really ask the questions: where epidemics come from? What is an endemic? Why do we go through pandemics? What are the lessons learned? Why don't we learn to keep things clean or to keep our distance? Where does our knowledge with how we deal with pandemics come from? Do they come from the bottom up, from populations? Or do they have to be taught, for example, by hygienic experts and political experts? I decided when Haley and Shane asked me to do this, I responded by, first of all, being a little reluctant, because as being one of the sponsors of this series, I wanted other people to kind of share the spotlight. But I thought, what better opportunity to talk a little bit about pandemics and medical mistrust than during this period of time that we're going through. And then I remembered Martin Luther King, who in 1965 in Montgomery, Alabama, speaking to a college of physicians at a conference, said that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane. And the reason for this is because there's very little out there other than health and in the injustice of health resources that speaks to our humanity, right? It questions who exactly is worthy of saving, who is worthy of healing, who is truly human, who belongs in our society and who doesn't. At the very heart of what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying, if you cannot take care of the health of the most oppressed, the most marginalized, of the poorest, then it is a completely unjust system. And I'm sure Julia, I don't know if Julia Filiol is here, but she's our big champion for the social justice theme at the college, at Broward College this year. This fits so perfectly with that theme that we're trying to cover for the year on social justice. And yet, chances are, in the middle of a pandemic, very few of us have even given it any thought.
Dr. Cornejo, excuse me, there's somebody that has a question. Tamara Willis, I'm gonna let you come on screen and ask your question. If anybody wants to ask a question in the Q&A, that's probably better just to type it in Q&A, but she had her hand up, so.
I think she had her hand up for a while, so it may have been at the very beginning.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right, so it's better to go in Q&A. Sorry for interrupting, go ahead.
No worries, anytime. Part of the things that we study in the social history of medicine, okay, and if any of my former honor students are in the auditorium or in the chat, you will recognize this book because it was one of your textbooks. You know, When Germs Travel, the 6 major epidemics that have invaded America and the fears that they have unleashed. And part and parcel of everything that we discuss in terms of pandemic policies and through the government, through cities and municipalities, et cetera, has to do with blame. And there's a rich history of blame when we're talking about the social history of medicine that we still see in today's society. Look at the anti-Asian sentiments that are out there, and this whole movement to try to blame China or anybody of Asian descent, right? And so the question that I normally ask my students, and the question that I believe Charles Rosenberg and Howard Markel and Alan Kraut ask is, where does this need to scapegoat an entire population come from? But when you study the social history of medicine, you realize that it's always been there. In the 1300s, during the great pandemic that we know as the bubonic plague, you know, the ones who were blamed were the Jews and the Muslims. And they were blamed specifically for bringing the plague. Why? Because they poisoned the well waters and they captured children and ate them. Completely silly things. But this need to scapegoat, this need to blame somebody is a very big part of American history as well. During the Industrial Revolution, and here we're talking about the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s, et cetera, there were 2 groups of people who were being blamed for the medical issues of the time, for bringing diseases, et cetera. One were the Jews, especially those coming in from Russia, who were blamed for typhoid fever and for tuberculosis, et cetera. And so they were being blamed, not because they were European, but because they were specifically Jewish, and that they didn't follow the same patterns of washing or habits of washing or eating, et cetera, as did Anglo-Saxon Americans of the 19th century. Had the 19th century Americans known that actually, you know, the kosher practices are much more sanitary and much cleaner than what any Anglo-Saxon practiced in the 19th century, I think the story would have been completely different. But the goal for these policymakers was to blame the Jews, not for their Eastern Europeanness, but for their Jewishness, their non-Christianness. And behind that is this idea, this question: how can a Jew possibly be American? Let that sink in for a bit. Because in the 1980s or 1990s, I think, I don't remember, we had the same question when Joe Lieberman was running for president. How is it possible that a Jewish person could become not only an American citizen, but an American president? And we all know the conversation that came around regarding Barack Obama. And so the Russian Jews at their time, because they were so foreign to Anglo-Saxon culture, they were so the other, right? And so foreign, they were being blamed for bringing these two diseases. Another group of people during the 19th century that were blamed were the Irish and the Italians, and we lumped them together. Why? For one simple reason. They didn't fit the American scheme or ethnic scheme or the religious scheme of Anglo-Saxon or a white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. The Irish and the Italians were Roman Catholics. And the last thing in the 19th century that the American organizations or politicians and wanted were the Catholics that were coming from Southern Europe. And if you know anything about the history of Europe, okay, it was the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, and the Portuguese that were the least desired in the United States during the 19th century. Right? There were a lot of aspersions sent their way. There were a lot of really nasty things that were said about the Southern Europeans. They spoke with their hands, they speak too loudly, everything's a party, everything is happy. Whoever is that happy all the time, there must be a problem. There was a whole slew of really ridiculous statements. And I want to put a caveat in there, because I just used the word caveat, ridiculous, as a 21st century citizen of America. And the number one rule that we should probably not be breaking during this entire conversation is this idea that, yes, we're judging them from 21st century perspective, which is not, it's not right. And in history, we call that presentism. When we judge the beliefs of the past by what we know today. These people had no clue about viruses, bacteria, and germs. They had no clue about what it meant, for example, to boil water in order to kill those bacteria. They knew they didn't die from it, but they didn't know why, which, if any American historians are on recall, will remember, during the colonial period, most Americans walked around half drunk. Why? Because they drank whiskey. It was safer. It was safer than drinking water that had been contaminated. And so when we judge the past, think about it the way they thought about it. We can't really apply our scientific knowledge, our scientific perspective now to what they were doing, because that would be unfair to them, in the same way that our descendants are not going to be able to do that with us. But there's a third group in here, much closer to home, especially here in South Florida. In the 1980s, the Haitians were the number one group, ethnic group, blamed for bringing AIDS to the United States of America. And we only have to go south 20 miles to hear, as Eric Fox talks about in his book, AIDS, A Historical Perspective, we only have to go south 20 miles to know that every Haitian that had been coming in through Miami Airport had been put in a hangar, right? Had been enclosed, not allowed to leave the airport. Why? Because they were going to be sent back to Haiti for the fear that they were bringing AIDS to the country. And before you knew it, my friends of Haitian descent in New York found themselves having to defend themselves, found themselves having to explain that, yes, they're Haitian, but they're not, bringing AIDS to the United States. And so this history of blame is a very big part of American social history of medicine. And once it sinks in, right, then you get to understand how people start to mistrust, The reasons, for example, that the Italians never went to hospitals, if you knew their history, was because back home in Italy, you only went to the hospital to die, right? Medical procedures weren't as advanced. There was no certainty that you would come out of a hospital alive. So if you're going to die anyway, you might as well die at home among your loved ones. Then they come to the United States, they bring the same mentality, and guess what? The public health officers of the United States can't figure out how to take these Italians to the hospital. Okay? And Alan Kraut, and you'll see at the bottom of of many of these screens, you'll see that I have a bibliographical quotation or something. These are the books from which this information comes. They're great resources. I've used many of them in my classes with my students, and they have liked them, etc. Another problem, rule number 2, or problem number 2 in the social history of medicine when it comes to medical mistrust, is unethical medical experimentation, which unfortunately has again, a rich history in the United States, but which very few people know about, which very few people are. So yes, we all know that, and I will talk a little about this a little later. We all know about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, but we don't know about other things. And in the history of the United States, I just have to go back to the 1940s to discuss what we did with Puerto Rican women. In the 1930s and 1940s, when Puerto Rico was being considered as a state and being more fully incorporated into the union that we call the United States of America, there was a huge question that was being asked. How do we turn Spanish-speaking, exotic and erotic peoples, right, who are Catholic, into white Anglo-Saxon Americans? How do we do that? And so the decision in Laura Briggs' book, Reproducing Empire, fantastic book, was the forced sterilization of Puerto Rican women. Why? Why go through all this? Thousands upon thousands of Puerto Rican women in the 1940s had been sterilized because there was no other way to make them fit into the American scheme of ethnicity, or the ethnic scheme that we thought America was about. This wrapped itself up in American imperialism. You know, how do we impose American hegemony onto cultures, ethnicities, tribes, nations, people, so that they can become part of who we are going to be as an empire? How do we grant these people citizenship when they don't even speak English? Or that they have an average of 4, 5, 6 children more than the typical American, when their attitudes towards sex and sexuality and affection towards their children is completely different from what the norm was in the United States? How do we fit them into the paradigms of American citizenship? It doesn't help that during the 20th century, there was also the science, and I put that in quotations, the pseudoscience of eugenics. And we all know how that went with Hitler. This idea of how do we create a perfect race? How do we create a perfect ethnicity? How do we control people? In some countries, the number of children being born to a family were controlled. In other countries, entire ethnic groups were decimated. In other cultures, they were assimilated. And in the United States, it was this process of eugenics, these eugenic policies were wrapped up in ways that would confine ethnicities into neighborhoods like Chinatown, like Little Italy, like Little Haiti, okay, like the west side of Manhattan for the Puerto Rican population, et cetera. How do we control this? And how do we make sure, check this out, that they don't go outside their ethnicity to breed? How do we make sure that only the intelligent breed, that only the ones who know how to deal with money breed? Because this was also a time when we believed that financial knowledge, financial abilities, reading ability, intelligence, et cetera, were all passed down biologically. And of course, the question of Americanization. How do we make people more American? I've been teaching for 33 years. 12 of those years, I've been teaching American history. And every single class, almost every single week, I ask the question, now that you know all this, what does it mean to be American? And guess what? In the year 2021, not a single one of my students has come to be able to define it. And yet, we spent most of the 19th century and 20th century as a nation trying to define it and impose it on other people, right? Out of the 40, 50 people that are on here now, I can bet that most of us would have a really hard time to defining American identity outside of maybe philosophy or memory or the Constitution. What does it mean? And so in her book, Reproducing Empire, Laura Briggs really focuses on why this need to make people American. Why not just accept them for who they are? And if you're talking about Puerto Rican women who are being sterilized and their descendants who know that their grandmothers, their mothers, their aunts had been sterilized in the 40s, how do you expect them to trust government policies and government officials? How do you expect them to trust public health experts when it's those very same experts that force this sterilization upon them?
Dr. Cornejo, we have a question from Juan Rosa.
Yes, Juan.
Dr. Cornejo, why are some people doubting about getting vaccinated? What can be said to encourage them to obtain the vaccine?
A really good question. I'm going to be talking about that at the end, Juan, because I think it's a lot more complicated of a question than we who do believe in science and we who do believe in vaccination, we take it for granted. But when you study the history, Juan, when you study what went on, right, and how people have reacted to forced vaccination, forced sterilization, and it's always ethnically based, Juan. I don't know if we can really blame them. The most we can do is probably understand where they're coming from, which is what I'm going to be talking about shortly, okay? We also have, and this is my last example for this, the famous syphilis experiments of Tuskegee University. We have all heard about these, right? In the social history of medicine, I don't think it would surprise you that we really don't study the data on this anymore. We don't look at giving the researchers any credit for this because it was so invalidated by the academic community and so horrendous that we have completely separated the historical discipline from the actual research that was produced or that was a product of these experiments. So in the social history of medicine, these Tuskegee experiments, we now call it a pseudoscience. That wasn't science. There was nothing scientific about that. It was about experimenting. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment wanted to know if if African-American men reacted the same way as white men to syphilis. So what did we do? We gave Black men syphilis. We didn't treat them. We didn't care for them. We gave them none of the resources that white people at that time were given because the goal was to study how the African-American body, the Black body, reacts to syphilis, knowing full well there were treatments. And what made it worse is that this man right here, one of the nurses and doctors who actually went from town to town, was assisted by an African-American nurse who you can imagine was already being called a traitor and all these other things, but that was her job. The syphilis experiments were what we call based on something of the time period called scientific or biological racism. These are researchers, scientists, philosophers, thinkers, etc., who actually believed that there was empirical proof that some races were biologically superior to others. And so they use that as part of their ideology. their thinking in order to justify the giving of syphilis to these African Americans. It's an experiment. It's for the betterment of knowledge. It's for the improvement of science. Most historians today would say BS. No, that's not what it was. Because when you ask the question, what were the genuine scientific questions that were being studied? Not a single researcher of that time period could answer. The Black bodies were so underestimated, were so undervalued, and so unlike white American bodies or white bodies, then why study them in the first place? That was the biggest question. If Black bodies are so different from white bodies, why are you so concerned with these experiments? If it's not just to improve the lives of whites or the majority. And so these main questions were never answered, and is another reason for why the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, at least in the social history of medicine, are studied, but the research is not, the data is not studied. It's been invalidated. Two really good books about this are James Jones's Bad Blood, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, which was came out in 1993, fantastic book. And he takes a little bit of a sociological perspective, Shane, so this is like maybe right up your alley. And Susan Reverby's Tuskegee Truth, Rethinking the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And she takes this study and looks at it from a variety of perspectives that include the social, the political, the religious, the intellectual, the technological, as well as the economic, okay? All of these questions were raised by an author of a book that's become very popular over the last, I would say, 3 years. Harriet Washington wrote a book called Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. And for my American history students, don't be surprised if this one day becomes a textbook. Fantastic book, but check out when she wrote this, 2006, almost 16 years before everything that we're going through right now. And in that book, she raises some important questions that still plague us today. One, why is it newspapers, or in the 21st century, social media, and not the research oversight organizations, whether it's the World Health Organization, whether it's the American Medical Association, et cetera, why is it the newspapers, she said, that have been instrumental in unveiling and ending egregious abuses? Why isn't the actual people in charge letting this information come to light? But it's newspapers, it's social media, it's Instagram, it's Twitter, right? We got to hear it from third-party sources when we'd rather hear it, right, Juan, from the powers that be. And yet, Juan, you wonder why people don't want to become vaccinated and why they don't want to become guinea pigs. Second question she asks, why should we give, in the history of medicine, the physician's medical narratives much more credence, more credibility, more power than we give to the numerous contentions of slaves, sharecroppers, and contemporary marginalized Americans and immigrants who have been subjected to abusive medical research? Why are we not listening to those people? And are their stories, are their tales not as important, not as valid, not as powerful as that of the doctors or the physicians? Because at the end of the day, who reads a physician's article? Other physicians. The public does not read them. And so medical experts usually write to other medical experts. But the people being experimented on, perhaps those stories, and this is something, Haley, that you would love as an ethicist, those stories are just as valid, just as true, right? Just as troublesome as some of the findings that the physicians and the researchers have come up with. And her third question, why have those who investigate the role of medical ethics and medical policy been trying to dissect and analyze the much decried African-American and marginalized aversion to medical research, vaccination, health studies, et cetera? without understanding the history that created that aversion. I'm going to put you on the spot, Haley, because you're an ethical philosopher. But I can almost guarantee that 9 out of 10 ethicists probably don't take into consideration the history that created those questions that you bring forward to your classes.
Yeah, so rarely we don't talk cross-disciplinary, and I wish we did more of it.
Yep.
So I'm glad to be in the student seat again, like I said, yeah.
But it is interesting how, ethicists, you would think they would look at the big picture, but they don't. You're busy, and I'm not putting you down at all, okay? But you're busy talking about Kant, and you're busy talking about the imperative, the categorical imperative, and you're thinking about all these other ethical issues. But there's a history behind that, right? Of people's wishes, people's problems, people's abuses, people's suffering, right? And of course, there's the recent experiences, things that have been part and parcel of what we've been hearing in the news regarding medical disparities or health disparities. We hear about discrimination. Why are our wealthier populations, Juan, getting vaccinated before poorer ones? What does that say about the value we put on poor people? There's poor communication. There is suspicions that are being raised as to, well, and I'll be honest, I even had this suspicion at the very beginning of all of this. How is it possible that a COVID vaccine was able to be produced so fast? And yet, going back to my original point, HIV has been around for 30, 40 years and nothing yet, not even anything close to a cure. How is that possible? And most historians, most philosophers, most experts will tell you a lot of it has to do with resources and how those resources are distributed. And so the problems that we see today, and this is where the concept of health justice comes in, how we see these issues today, how we see this history alive in the 21st century, we see in the disparities in access to healthcare. We see these disparities in the quality of the care they receive, rather than being talked with, right? Black patients, Hispanic patients, immigrant patients are talked to by the health experts that they see, right? And of course, the health outcomes. We know what the statistics say about, for example, Black women and breast cancer. We know what the statistics say about immigrants or about obesity or about other health issues. We know that, but that's where the disparities come in. And these disparities also create bias. So for example, the way that patient and providers interact. Some physicians talk with their patients. Some physicians talk down to their patients, and they blame their patients for not following the treatment decisions or adhering to those treatment prognoses or processes or treatment, what's the word I'm looking, routines, the way other people would. And this leads to the problems and to the bias we think about when we talk about patient health outcomes. There is a reason, Juan, that people who doubt the medical profession don't want to be vaccinated. And I just spent 13 slides talking about that history, which raises my main question. After you know all of this, Juan, can you really blame them? As a historian, I can tell you, yeah, I can understand them, but that's about it. I know where it's coming from. But when you look at the history, when you look at what Kraut has written, when you look at what Fox has written, when you look at what Oppenheimer has written about the history of social medicine, can we really sit back and blame them, knowing full well what you just learned? And I will end it there. I let that sink in, because that was originally going to be the title of this presentation. Can you really blame them? Thank you, Dr. Gunderson. Thank you, Dr. Mathis.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
I wanted to ask you if you were going to be staying until the end in case
I will
somebody
be.
has questions at the end.
Yes.
Okay. All right then. So then we'll go forward unless do you have any questions, Haley?
I was thinking maybe just due to time, we could let there be a Q&A for both
Yeah,
of you.
do it at the end.
That might work.
Okay, so everybody hold your questions in the Q&A until the end, and then I do have the ability to let you ask on camera where you can do it, or you can type it in the Q&A and just tell me your name and that you can't go on camera. All right, so our second speaker will explore how Stoicism can perhaps guide us in embracing this challenging period that we are in right now. And she's actually going to recommend ways for us to make the best of it. I want to stress the timeliness of her message. She has great passion. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about her. She's originally from Argentina. She moved to the US in 1981 to raise her family. And just like a lot of mothers, she went back to school, and she's an alumni here at Broward College. She went to the North Campus. She got her associate degree in arts. She was inspired by Dr. Rieger, and she pursued a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master's in liberal arts with a concentration in philosophy from FAU. The same day that she was graduating, she scheduled an interview at Broward College for a job. And since that moment, philosophy has become a way of life and, again, a passion of hers. She is an adjunct professor, and she teaches intro to philosophy, ethics, and occasionally she teaches logic. Please give a loud round of virtual applause to Professor Nora Ayala as she presents how philosophy can help us to transition during these difficult times.
Well, good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to my home. I'm going to be
Nora, you froze.
all of the passion of philosophy, okay? And I remember when I went to talk to him and I said, listen, something is wrong with me. I'm reading the Republic when I go to sleep. He said, well, you caught the virus of philosophy. Go for it because you have the rest of your life to learn. And I followed his advice, and here I am, happy to be to complete the cycle or the circle and being back in Broward College. And also, I want to thank you, my colleagues, Dr. Pedro Oliveira and Joshua Kimber, that another philosophy professors in Central, that they were the ones that pushed me when I asked, how can I do it in the classroom? They said, go, you can manage, okay? So thank you for here with me and some part of my family, my beautiful daughter, Gabby, my son-in-law, Phil, who keeps me always on my toes, asking me a lot of questions about philosophy. So I will focus probably from the last PowerPoint presentation of Dr. Cornejo, which was wonderful, but leave us with all like a sad feeling, how things are not well done, how can we make this war a better one? Okay, I will focus on the third question that he left us thinking. What can we do? Or what will be our position? So in order to do that, I invite all of you to travel in time. We're going to move to Greece 24 centuries ago. I'm talking about 2,400 years ago, to study a philosophical school that is starting in Athens, in the city of Athens, long time ago. In the like I said, 2,400 years ago. And today there is a resurgence of Stoicism, but with something that somebody asked me from the audience before, that I want to make it very clear. The Stoicism that I will focus on today is the school or the philosophical school based on reason. A lot of kind of a Stoicism for dummies or a Stoicism 101 is trying to push some of the concepts of the Stoicism into the mainstream of New Age. And that's what we have to focus. And I want to make it clear before I start that I'm going to talk about Stoicism, which is based on reason. The Stoicism for dummies and the repetition and all that, it has more to do with feelings or emotions that they don't have anything to do with reason. Okay, so I will teach you, let's say, the true version of Stoicism. If you look at in the dictionary, okay, Stoicism, the first definition that will appear, it will be like it is a noun, and it is described as the endurance of pain or hardship without the displays of feelings and without complaint. And we will see, and I will prove you, that's not what the Stoics have as a purpose. The second definition in the dictionary is ancient Greek school of philosophy. Okay, I will focus on that one. How does Stoicism start in Greece? A guy named Zeno in the 3rd century BC loses all his fortune. He was a very wealthy merchant. He loses all his fortune. He gave up with his business. He moves to Athens, and he goes into what we call right now a bookstore, falling in love with a book in philosophy. And he asked the attendant of the store, where can I keep studying this? And the attendant said, go outside. There are plenty of them. Of course, in Athens, probably you went outside, and what you saw was philosophers walking around. So Zeno went outside, and I started taking classes and being more in tune with Socratic philosophy. And he decided to start conducting classes in a building, in a colonnade. There wasn't just in a porch, that it was called the painted porch, which in Greek will be, okay, stoa poikili. This is why, because of the painted porch where they sat down on the steps to have their classes, became what we call now Stoicism. Okay, so one of his disciples, or the people who studied with him, was Chrysippus, okay, who gave more the basis of what we know today as Stoicism. And the school is divided in 3 periods, okay? The early Stoa and the middle Stoa. The early Stoa starts with Zeno and to the period of Antipater. The middle Stoa goes probably from Antipater up to Posidonius. And both of them were Hellenistic schools, what it means that they took place in Greece. Unfortunately, we don't have anything written from them. Nothing survived from them in a written form. But we have the latest Stoa that took place in Imperial Rome. And that's where the richest part of Stoicism make way to us to learn from them, okay? And who do we have? Who are the 3 bigger guys in the Imperial Rome, or the Roman Empire? We have Seneca, in order, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. All of them in after the Common Era. So we have Hellenistic before the Common Era, the Roman Empire, Stoicism, or latest Stoa in the Roman Empire. And that's where we get in touch with writings from those 3 philosophers. Not only Stoicism was very important and influential during this time, but also was very influential to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and to, let's call it modern philosophy, René Descartes, the French philosopher, and Baruch Spinoza. Both of them are the 17th century. In modern times, we will see, when we get to Marcus Aurelius, that his meditations have an extreme impact, for example, in Nelson Mandela. And I want to explain later how the meditations switch the approach to apartheid that Nelson Mandela was confronting during his time in prison, and when he became the first African president of South Africa. Okay, so let's go through a little the history of the latest Stoa, the one that we know more, okay? And we start with Seneca. Seneca, what do we have from Seneca? his books called Letters from a Stoic. You don't need any publication or any edition that I will recommend to you. These are so old that these books, you can get it for free in the internet. So you can Google them and you can have it in PDF form. That's a good thing about philosophy. Sometimes you pay more for the delivery of the book than getting the book, okay? So Seneca was born in Cordova in Spain, that was part of the Roman Empire. And he was the educator of the later emperor Nero, not well known in the history of the Roman Empire, which was kind of competition with Aristotle. Aristotle, well, he educated Alexander the Great. So probably Seneca didn't feel that he went up to the plate as Aristotle, creating a great, what they tried to achieve, a philosopher king. Seneca wrote 124 letters, the letter of the Stoics, and he writes to his friends Lucilius. And then we have Epictetus. Epictetus' story is a very sad story. He was born what we know now as Turkey. He was a slave, and even his name didn't have a name. His name means acquire, so probably bought him. And his master broke one of his legs beyond repair. And so he lived in Rome, practiced Stoicism in Rome, and then he vanished and he moved to North Greece, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. What we have from Epictetus is the discourse. He believed that we need to internalize our intention. So look how profound he thought, that we need to intensify every effort that we pour in our intention. That implies practice, care, and focus. And after our intention, nothing is under our control. It's like we have to let it go. The perfect example is, think that you are an archer, okay? And you go to a competition. You have extreme control, or you can put all your effort in your intention to practice, to have the best equipment, and to focus into the target, okay? And then the minute that you pull it back and you let it go, your control is gone. Because that arrow can go any place the arrow wants. So what does it mean? That in circumstances like the pandemic, where should we put the effort? We should put the effort in the internal, on the intention. How is it that we want to live through this? The outcome, I don't know. But at least I will know that I'm trying to do, guided by reason always, what it could be the best that I can do. So the first advice that Epictetus gives us, which is, I think is one of the most important, we should have a bumper sticker. It says, never become attached to the outcome. Because basically you don't have control on the outcome. You only have control on where you can put your intention. Marcus, and also another tidbit of philosophy, Epictetus, it was known for a very cynic sense of humor. And one anecdote was that at one time they said, well, why do we worry about death? And he said, well, listen, if you're going to spend your time worrying if you should have dinner before death, just in case you die, maybe you eat dinner early, or other way around, they said, why to worry? Just worry on the dinner, but not on death, because you never know when it's going to come. Okay, so he was able to put some humor in something that practically worries all of us. And then we have Marcus Aurelius. And when I say Marcus Aurelius, a glow comes to my face probably, because he was what Plato defined probably as the perfect philosopher king. His wisdom was amazing. And he was going to be remembered as one of the best emperors in the Roman Empire. And Marcus Aurelius had a hard life. He lost his parents young. He was adopted by the husband of one of his aunts that put him in the line to become an emperor later. And he was raised under a strict Stoic school. As a matter of fact, he trained sometimes not to sleep on his bed and sleep on the floor as a kid. And when they asked him, why are you sleeping on the floor? He said, well, so when I go back to the bed, I realize how good it is. And also I practice not become attached to the bed in case one day I have to sleep on the floor. He was born in 121 AD, and at 161 AD, he became an emperor. So he was 40 years old at that time. And why I say the philosopher king? Because that's what Plato envisioned from a ruler. And imagine from the ruler of the Roman Empire, how big it was, one of the biggest empires in the history of the world. And he did it with so much temperance, with so much wisdom. And he has to go so much through that probably Stoicism gave him the strength of character to go through all the tragic endurances of his life. He lost his wife at a young age. He fought 2 wars, and he lost most of his children. Only one survived him, which was extremely sad for him because he had a tremendous amount of love for his family. As a matter of fact, the first meditation is dedicated to his grandfather, who took care of him. And he's the author, of course, of the meditations. And like I said, the meditations he didn't write the meditations as a book to be published. The meditation was a compilation of his most inner thoughts, of his most inner reflections in his heart. And it's a book that is not difficult to read. Maybe it's too long. Yes, I have to recognize that. But for example, when Nelson Mandela was in prison, somebody gave it to him, another prisoner, make sure that he received the meditations. And what Nelson Mandela said that he learned about the meditation was to ask himself, when I come out of prison, what do I do with the past? And he learned from the meditation that he didn't have anything possible. It was under his control to change the past, but it was in his control to make a better future. So he left behind any type of hatred, and he moved forward for unity, for a better unified country. So also it's well known that President Clinton always carried the meditations with him. So getting to know all this, we need to know what are the premises of Stoicism. And they're very simple. First, live your life through nature. They have a very high respect for nature that goes into kind of in synchrony or through nature is to be one with nature. Also, they assume that human beings, this is a very Aristotelian concept, were social and rational. So we flourish in society and we're guided by reason. The third one is that happiness is peace and serenity. That's something that we can relate to our times now. What is happiness? Maybe it's contempt, to be at peace, to be at serenity with ourselves, to do what we feel like we would like to do, to stretch ourselves to people that maybe need us, to give voice to the voiceless. Okay, so it's a very good concept, that sense of contempt. Not to say there is no formula for happiness, but that we can achieve contempt, yes, we can. Also, ask yourself always, and this is good when it comes to the vaccine. Ask yourself always in any of your different roles, because we play different roles in society. Professor, mother, grandma, friend, speaking from me, okay? And all of you, not only within our family, but within society. So how do we live those different roles as social, rational human beings? Okay? It's asking us ourselves the question, when we do something, is this good for humanity? And maybe that could be like a little solution for this distrust for the vaccine. Maybe when we receive the vaccines, to think at that moment, what am I doing? I know it's good for me, but is this also good for humanity? Yes, it is. Because if we receive the vaccine only our country and we forget about the rest of the country, what are we going to do? We're going to live the rest of our lives inside? No, we need to help others to prosper ourselves. So the advice from them is play your role the best you can, not only for yourself, but also for humanity. And the last one is providence is guided by God, while human beings were guided by virtue. And that's an idea, also a very Aristotelian idea for those who knows philosophy, okay? But now we're going to understand how is it that all these concepts is easy to put into practice, because the Stoics are very pragmatic in a sense, and they put it in very simple terms. And the whole philosophy is based on two pillars. The first pillar compromise 4 virtues, okay? And the second pillar encounters us with the dichotomy of what control is. So the 4 virtues are, first is practical wisdom. Well, wisdom is the virtue of reason. According to Aristotle, wisdom was the highest virtue, okay? So it helps us to recognize what is under our control and what is beyond our control. Let's say, according to Seneca, okay, which is very practical, and probably those who teach philosophy will agree with him, like I do, is virtues, you cannot separate them, okay? The Stoics put 4, Aristotle extended to 12, okay? But Seneca said that all the virtues work as the council of the city. And who's the head of that council? Wisdom. So in order for that council of virtue who will guide us to make good decisions, we need to strengthen wisdom, because wisdom will guide all those other virtues. The second one is moral courage. And in my humble personal opinion, I believe that our society today needs moral courage. Moral courage to come up and denounce what is right and support it, and denounce what is wrong. We cannot turn our face to inequalities like Dr. Cornejo talked about it. But in order to face that, we need to exercise moral courage, the courage to predicate what is moral, the courage to maybe to dream that through education, through sharing these talks, we can make this world a better place. But if we don't have the courage, if we only take care of what is for me, of what is good for my immediate family, but don't have the courage to intervene on that, we're missing a big point. And we're losing one of the most important pillars, because that's the function as a member of a society. The third one is justice, probably the most important one, okay? Because doing the right thing, advocating for justice, for what is right, is at the core of all other virtues. I cannot express moral courage from an unjust position, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to support what I want and what it benefits me, which is unjust. It's not justice at all, okay? So let me see my notes here, sorry. Marcus Aurelius give us an easy advice. Quote, if it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it, end of quote. And that goes straight to the point to all those conspiracies going around. What is the proof that they are true or not? So if you are not sure that they are true, don't say it. And if you know that it's not right, don't do it. If those doctors knew that doing studies injecting syphilis in healthy African American people, they knew it was not right. So don't do it. Simple like that. We don't need to go beyond to looking for more answers when there is no more than one. It's unjust. In other words, it's easy. Keep always your eyes on the truth. Because the truth will always prevail. And as Martin Luther King says, that the universe always bends towards truth. Sooner or later, the truth will come out. And the last one, that is the one that is the core of all the misunderstandings, okay, is temperance of endurance. It means also moderation. And temperance is need to what? To create good habits. And there is a misconception because sometimes we think that the Stoics, oh, they pray for hardship. They enjoy that, they are kind of the masochists. No, not at all, okay? Because hardship is universal. Sooner or later, all of us, this year showed that sooner or later, we all were confronted with hardship. So what is the key here? Is how we're going to deal when the hardship comes to us. Seneca gave us a good advice in the letter 67 to his friend Lucilius. And you will see, it's like he's talking to us now during the pandemic. Quote, nor I am so mad to crave illness, but if I must suffer illness, I shall desire that I may do nothing that shows lack of restraint and nothing that is unvirtuous, end of quote. Which is right. If I have to endure illness, please give me the strength to be virtuous, not to mistreat my nurse, not to insult the doctors, and not to blame others. To take complete responsibility and to endure it as an Stoic will do it, not because they like to be ill, because they like to be virtuous when they manage the hardship. And the second pillar is very important, is the dichotomy of control. So reason will help us through wisdom to distinguish the things that we have control on it and the things that we do not have control. And we talk about it. Epictetus talks about that. Put all your effort in the intention. Let's go to COVID-19. Do I have any idea how this is going to end? No. But what is my intention? To take care of myself and the people around me and to stop contagion. So what do? I wear my mask, I disinfect things, wash my hands, and I keep my social distance the best way that I can. Why to worry and waste energy in something that is completely out of my control? I can't do it, okay? So the effort and energy should be on the things that we can make our best. And here comes the exercise, okay? And I want all of you, if Shane will be in charge, to bring people up to the plate. And it's how to live like a Stoic.
Nora,
Okay?
there's a lot of questions coming up. Are you about to wrap up?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm done, almost done. First, we need to separate, how do we live like a Stoic? Is separating first. What is the first step? Separate what is internal versus what is external. The internal can be controlled. We can choose how to confront the reality, and it's worth the time and our energy. What is out of our control, since we cannot control, it entertains our imagination and creates anxiety. And it doesn't mean that it has to be accepted. So focus on the internal. Second, great exercise. Embrace discomfort. According to Seneca, we need to visualize what it could be possible. Well, we can visualize, what if I get COVID and I need to go to the hospital? Can I bear it? Well, maybe you can say no. Or maybe you can say, well, I will get prepared. I will read more how to cope with a situation like that. Okay? So, and the same with death. The Stoics said for us not to fear about death. Don't dwell on death, because we're not certain when it's going to come, but we're certain that it will come one day. But more dangerous than fear death is not to live a meaningful life. Okay? So what we have to do is to start living. So Marcus Aurelius reflects, quote, "It is not death that man should fear, but rather he should fear never beginning to live." So don't, end of quote, don't let fear stop you from having a meaningful time. Don't let COVID stop you from joining virtual classrooms. Don't stop this pandemic for improving who you are. And the third, focus on the journey. Again, the journey is full of new things. The Stoics embrace challenge, and they look, the people who embrace the Stoicism embrace new challenge, and they invent new challenge. Will I be able to learn a new language during this year that I'm inside? Well, I will try. We invent things to keep us what? Training, preparing in what is going to come. Okay, Marcus Aurelius decided that life is a wrestling match, okay? And while Epictetus said that the universe will be always our trainer, always putting little challenges to make us stronger. And if the universe doesn't put the challenges, we look or we invent them to keep in shape. And the fourth one, and the most beautiful one, that is the key of all these, is live virtually, okay? Just embrace virtue. Aristotle said, what is the purpose of human beings? The good life. And the good life is the life of virtue. And we're going to achieve what he called eudaimonia, which is a contempt, a peace with ourselves. And he said, Marcus Aurelius said, quote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Just be one." End of quote. And with this, okay, I would like just to say that in my personal note, this pandemic gave me the opportunity to embrace so many other venues, to increase my knowledge, to try to become a better person, to separate what it was under my turf and what it was outside my control, and to participate in something so amazing like things like this. I think we are always remember COVID like the year that the classroom opened to the world. Okay, thank you very much.
Beautiful quote to end it on. Thank you. I'll turn it to Shane for Q&A. Sorry.
Okay, I let talking be permitted. So all of you that were typing your questions in the Q&A, if you want to go ahead and just ask them, go ahead.
I'll be first.
Go ahead.
What I heard, and I'm not a philosophy PhD, is that the two pillars to focus on are wisdom and courage. And I wondered if knowledge somehow fits into this and should be added to what is critical, thinking back to the people that broke into the Capitol in January, that from their perspective, they had wisdom and they definitely had courage, but they lacked knowledge. And I wondered from a philosophical point of view, how this affects the key pillars that were discussed. Thank you.
Okay, let me think about it. I think going through wisdom, if wisdom is the virtue of reason, I don't think they didn't have that much wisdom at all. Because overall, and looking from, and Haley, I don't know if she agrees with me, looking from the philosophical point of view that we're trained to look at from reason, it was an irrational act. Because it was irrational what it was done. And I give you an example of the irrationality of the act. People holding police lives matters, hitting with the flag policemen. So that's completely, it's a reduction to absurd. It's not rational at all. So to me, the wisdom, that wasn't too much in there. Lack of knowledge, again, knowledge and reason come hand to hand. It was a misjudgment in that sense, but you can see that some people knew that they were doing wrong because they were texting others, don't get into the Capitol, it is wrong. And some people say, hey, come on, man, we're all in here. So they were, with my students, we tackled that from the point of determinism. Were those people free to do what they did or not? And what were determined to do? I don't think they exercised their wisdom. And when it comes from the point of reason, I think they go more into the irrational because they attacked the people that they claim to defend. They wanted to kill the vice president, the one that they vote. So to me, it was more than 50% irrational.
Thank you. No, I didn't think about the irrationality, and I'm glad you explained it that way. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I'm glad to answer to you. Okay.
Another question, please.
Yes, I am troubled by the broad brush of the discussion this afternoon. And the reason I am is because in the community in which I was brought up, in which I was reared, a community of ranchers and soldiers and agriculturalists and builders and Native American communities, the practices of eugenics and medical experiments and whatever else we might throw in there were neither matters of policy nor practice among these citizens. And yet the broad brush is, I mean, the terminology used refers to, the American society or whatever. Okay, in other words, there's something at large that is referenced. Shouldn't our discussion be more focused on the policymakers, the academics, the medical practitioners, in other words, the self-appointed masterminds who were directly involved in the eugenics movement from the late 1800s into the 1940s, and also those involved, in medical experimentation and so on. Shouldn't that be our focus rather than the broad brush in which we include ranchers and food producers? The only eugenics they were concerned about was to develop a better grain of wheat with which to feed the world and a leaner beef with which to feed you and me.
Do you both want to answer that?
I can answer that because I think that's more directed to me. At the very beginning, I did mention that this is about the policymakers. Most agriculturalists, most people at the heartland of American society couldn't give two squats about any of this, right? All they wanted to do, which is still true, at the end of the day, what we want to do as people, as members of communities, Professor Rieger, is to feed our children and clothe their backs and put clothing on their backs. And so you are absolutely right, which is why I was talking about the public health experts. They are the ones who define, right, citizenship. They are the ones who make these policies. They're the ones who would probe the eyelids of the immigrants coming over from Italy or from Argentina to make sure that they were not diseased or anything like that. And yes, all of these policies, right, were made by what we today would call public health experts, right? John Long being one of them. There's a whole slew of them. And so yes, agriculturalists, Native Americans, the immigrants themselves, et cetera, Professor Rieger, would not have been the ones defining these experiments or setting up the parameters or designing them in any way, shape, or form. It is always the powers that be.
And among the powers that be, unfortunately, oftentimes include our guild, the Guild of Academics.
Absolutely.
And I'm concerned that we're not very, speaking of blaming, we're not very self-critical of our role, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps our role is on the margins, given that in most.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the main arguments I've had with some of my friends is how unpatriotic it is to be critical of ourselves. And I don't see it that way. If I really love my nation, my country, my being American, then why would I not want to question it in order for it to be better, right? The same thing that we do in a marriage, in a relationship. Nothing is ever perfect. We just want it to be better every day. And so, yes, these kinds of questions, Professor Rieger, have to be asked of the public health experts, of the academics, because after all, it is we who teach young Americans how to become American, whether it's through the Pledge of Allegiance, whether it's through Monroe Doctrine or doctrination or ideology. We teach them that. And so that's where the emphasis on critical thinking comes in. Looking at ourselves and realizing, it's not just about us.
Great discussion here. We have ladies who's got her hand up.
Go ahead, ladies.
Can I just interrupt?
Yes.
But the conversation should go on. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements because some people might have to sign off since we're out of time. But it's like the end of, we stick around and ask questions, that's fine. I just wanted to quickly make two announcements, which is that if you're interested in presenting and being a faculty presenter, just email me. And the second is if you want PD credit for it and you signed up for the On My Learning, you just have to go in and do like a 1-minute survey and you'll get PD credit. Okay, and conversation continue.
Go ahead, ladies.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, this question is for Dr. Edward. So I would like to know about the Pfizer vaccine. Can the Pfizer vaccine or Moderna alter the DNA of people? And is it possible that this vaccine has a negative impact on people's health on the long term? Then the other question will be, I read that COVID-19 has like HIV cells or proteins or something like that. Is it possible that the COVID-19 vaccine protects people against HIV or puts cells of HIV in people?
I'm going to answer the second question really quickly first. I really hope so. In fact, that's a conversation I've been having with my own physician because he deals primarily with men's health. And so he knows what I do for a living. He knows I'm a historian of medicine. And we've been talking about that. He does not think it will lead to a cure, ladies, yet, because the coding and if there are any medical experts on the chat, please chime in, are so vastly different, right? They respond to different nucleotides. They respond to very different parts of the virus, okay? Your first question I find really interesting because I got the Moderna one. I was a little sleepy, etc. But I think that has more to do with how much you buy into immunology, right? If you're more knowledgeable regarding the science behind immunology or inoculation or vaccines, you're probably more likely to trust it because we've seen in the past how it's worked with polio. We've seen in the past how it's dealt with smallpox, etc. That does not answer your question, ladies, because at the end of the day, I would imagine that it is not our DNA specifically that changes, and this is just my opinion, ladies, but it is the way we respond to an invasive body in our own bodies. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So for example, one of the most interesting things that blew my mind when I took my very first anthropology of medicine course, ladies, is this idea that we never ever, when we are sick, we never experience the actual virus. What we are experiencing is a dis-ease, being an ill at ease. What we are experiencing is our body's reaction to that invasive body, but not the virus itself. So that, okay? And I remember when the professor said that, and I just sat there listening to her, and I'm like, ooh, okay, just completely changed my view in terms of medicine, in terms of biology, in terms of immunology, because it's really all about how we perceive things, right?
Yes, yes. And on reference of the HIV protein or cells, what do you know about it?
I'm still having that discussion with my physician out of just like normal conversations. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. He and I are both very, obviously very frustrated. Like I said earlier, that 40 years have gone by and there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress. But what he tells me is that the mRNA, the messenger RNA, ribonucleic acid, is very, very different. And so that's why those two things don't correlate.
Barbara would like to ask a question.
First of all, I want to say thank you for discussing, all of you, this topic in context, because we seem to be rewriting our history at times, if it's history that we find offensive now, which we do. My question has to do with groups. Is it true that originally Planned Parenthood and abortion and birth control access was designed as eugenics to reach people of color who could not afford or had access to those services? And United Way supports Planned Parenthood. And I have heard some pretty deep discussions about that topic when it comes to contributing to United Way. Thank God the college doesn't pressure people.
Right. I have heard that, Professor Brayak, in the past. I'm not an expert on Planned Parenthood, but I have seen articles where if you look at when it came about, right, in the mid 20th century,
The history.
It would make sense. I mean, completely. It would make sense because that was also a time period in which it was believed that poverty could be passed down from generation to generation, that the way we think about money can be passed down from generation to generation, that intelligent parents had intelligent children, that unintelligent parents had unintelligent children, right? And so it does not surprise me whatsoever. And I'm sure there is a rich literature out there on Planned Parenthood, women's, I mean, if you look at anything in women's studies, gender history, etc., you're going to find something.
Okay.
In fact, I'm going to look for it for you.
Yeah, I just think it was history. It was so interesting talking within history and eugenics.
Yeah.
So thank
Unfortunately,
you for
like
that.
what I tell my students, Professor Brayak, is if you're doing history correctly and you're not frustrated or angry or upset, then you're doing it all wrong.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Nora.
Dr. J, you had a question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was at a conference years ago in Central, and the author of an excellent book on eugenic gave a conference, okay? And the purpose of abortions, of what the Planned Parenthood was at that time. Wasn't called Planned Parenthood, but what it took place, it was in abortion and sterilization of people that they were considered no good. And the bumper sticker, let's say, you know, of eugenic at that time is, if we spend so much time perfecting our pigs, why we don't spend time perfecting our race? So a lot of what happened in West Virginia, a lot of Irish people were sterilized because, well, they didn't like them. They were not smart enough and all that. So the purpose maybe, and what happened with eugenics once World War II, and what happens to the Jewish community under the Nazi regime, eugenic erased the names and became genetics, okay, here in the United States. So
Okay.
I think, okay, that what the founders maybe of what is today Planned Parenthood didn't have the same aim of the same purpose that Planned Parenthood have today. So from my point of view, I will find any conflict in maybe donating to an organization who supports, because the service that they give us now, they don't have anything to do with the practice of eugenic in the past. So that's from the ethical point of view.
Okay. Dr. J had a question.
Not so much a question as a comment regarding the same eugenics and Margaret Sanger and her organization, which eventually evolved into Planned Parenthood. Because of my religious convictions, I don't support abortions. And I do know that Planned Parenthood makes this available to people. My contention with that is, why can't we promote birth control in such a way that more people will have access, more poor people will have access to birth control, rather than having to seek abortions as an alternative to that? Anyone who could comment on that, please?
Go ahead, Nora.
Okay, and then you go, Ed. You said that you oppose abortion on religion's belief, right? Well, why?
That is correct.
Yeah, why we don't give contraceptives? Because of religious belief. If people, and here is the problem of semantics, okay? We don't get on the same page on the meaning of when a human being or a human life starts. We cannot talk about forms of anticonception, okay, or the pill and all that, because if we understand like a human life starts at the time of conception, then even taking the pill is a form of abortion, because every time that a couple makes love or have sex, whatever you want to call it, and the woman goes through her cycle, okay, if you take the pills that change the pH of the tissue, the internal tissue of the uterus, you are aborting Susie, John, Peter, and all those things, potential human beings that they are there. So this is why there is a lot of controversy on that, because yes, we can give more contraception, but religion is against contraception. Go and convince the Catholic Church that distributing to the poor contraception is okay. You can't. So how do you choose the best of, from the religious point of view, how do you choose the best of the two evils?
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like Dr. J, what I was going to take the same route to answering your question. It really depends upon which religious conviction you're talking about. So for example, within the Catholic Church, it's a very Thomistic philosophy that if life is potentially there, then it must be protected, because even a potential life is a life, right? And so for a while in the 20th century, until Pope John Paul II, the idea of birth control was centered around the rhythm method, right? A woman knows when she's ovulating, when to be able to conceive. She knows this. She knows her body. She knows it well. And so prior to John Paul II, what was being advocated, Dr. J, is this idea that, okay, well, if you don't want children, then when you're ovulating, you do not engage in sexual relations with your husband. But then in 1979, something happened. The purpose of marriage was redefined by Pope John Paul II in his Humanae Vitae, in which he said that the primary objective of marriage, the primary goal of any loving relationship is love. And if you are guiding your life by a rhythm method in order to prevent that natural spontaneity of the expression of love, then it's birth control.
I might have to interrupt and just thank everyone again. I know we're running out of time. I hate to stop I always try to figure this out with Zoom of like letting the conversation
we
go
can end
on.
it. I can stay on for a couple of minutes.
I miss it. I miss that in the classroom, just those one-on-one conversations. But I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming and yeah, and our speakers as well. And yeah, thank you. And if you're interested in doing a talk for us, if you're a faculty member, just give me I'll put my email into the chat box. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I still have to say, you know, I don't agree because there are many different types.
I don't think you're going to find anybody here who will disagree with you, Dr. J.
But surely the women who are seeking abortions, are they all Christians or all Catholics and are opposed to birth control?
I don't think you're ever going to be able to answer that question.
No.
You're probably right.
We'll find that out the day after I die.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay,
I had
so
a quick question if there's still time.
Oh, absolutely. If Haley and Shane don't.
Okay, so my name is Yana, and this question is for Dr. Cornejo. So as far as I've understood, I mean, I know your talk was based around mistrust in the medical community from people who historically have been disenfranchised, but how would you address like I don't know if you call it a movement, but the mistrust from individuals who are educated and not from historically disenfranchised communities, especially I know like a proportion of the anti-vaccine movement, they haven't historically been marginalized. So how would you kind of address that mistrust?
That's I love that question. Jana, is it?
Jana.
Because one of the latest statistics I've read is that most people, hold on, how do I rephrase it? A high percentage of people who do not vote in elections are people with PhDs and master's degrees, because they are so skeptical of the system. Oh, I don't doubt you whatsoever. You know, because unfortunately, when you do become an academic and you are enfranchised, right? And you are privileged, whether it's academically or socioeconomically, et cetera. Many people in those communities are much more skeptical because they know the history or because they just think about things a little differently. All right. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, well, how would they gain trust in the system? Like, do they know too much and there's just no way to like trust?
Sometimes I think as historians, we tend to be very I think many of us tend to take the non-altruistic view of the human being because we know too much. We know what basic human nature is like. And that's why I tell my students, I don't know if you're a student or a faculty member, but I tell my students, if you're not frustrated and angry with what we're doing in history, rather than social studies, which is just the memorization of names, dates, and events, as far as I'm concerned, then you're doing history wrong.
Right.
You should be upset, you know. that goes back to that question: are human beings by nature good, or are they, are they not good? Are we by nature?
I have a follow-up question, comment to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was at my favorite watering hole and people were talking about the vaccines. And there's this gentleman who said he will definitely not take the J&J because J&J is known for recalling stuff. And then look at what happened to J&J vaccine. Then the others that we have, some of the articles that I have read say that Pfizer and Moderna has something that is called luciferin in it, or luciferase. I'm not quite sure which one. And then, according to all these 5G towers that are being put up all over the world, they're making way for the last days on Earth, Armageddon, so to speak, where we will have to be scanned, so to speak, with the other one, luciferin or luciferase, to see how much of that enzyme we have in our body to say that, yes, we have been immunized against COVID. For that reason, I am afraid of taking any vaccine, because when we read Revelation says that in the book of Revelation in the Bible, it says that in the last day or days, we will be required, in order to survive in this earth, we will be required to have the mark of the beast. And I don't know if these vaccines or any one of the vaccines are precursors to the mark of the beast. And I don't want to subject myself willingly to that.
Right. No, well, I think there have always been people who believe that, in fact, even today, we can't go to a school without getting our mumps, measles, and rubella vaccine, or a smallpox vaccine, or if you're Latin American, you're still getting tuberculosis vaccines, etc. But I think it all boils down to this idea of, how much of your religious doctrine you believe, right? Because there are some Christians, for example, just to respond to your question specifically about Revelations, who don't put a lot of faith into Revelations because it was, written 30, 40, 50 years after the death of Jesus, right? By St. John. And it depends on your denomination. It depends on your own religious beliefs. It depends on how you were trained, etc. For those of us who are a little bit more scientifically based, hey, listen, I did pretty well with smallpox. I did pretty well with polio, and that's thanks to vaccines.
I have one thing, okay? And maybe Dr. Ye, you can walk with me through what I talk about the Stoics. Let's focus on wisdom, okay? And wisdom is the virtue of reason. Years ago, everybody needed a yellow fever passport to go everywhere, basically.
I remember that, yes.
Yeah, and nobody thought about it was the mark of the beast.
Yes.
Okay, so why now? And that was another question. Let reason talk about that, and just like we said, how rational is that thought? Mm-hmm. And also from the scientific point of view, I can tell you, I can explain you the modified RNA, how the vaccines work. And the source that I would use is the Johns Hopkins Institute of Health. And the way that they explain those vaccines is, once you're inoculated with that vaccine, think of that like a piece of Lego, okay? Think about a piece of Lego that attaches, like the Lego attaches, and start producing a protein. Probably sooner or later, we're going to have a cure for diabetes, because we're going to be able to attach another piece of Lego and have the production of insulin. So in 3 or 4 years from now, another virus come up, because the more people transgress nature and more contact we have between humans and animals, we're going to have more problems like COVID-19. Okay, so these vaccines and this technique invented or discovered by an Hungarian scientist, a woman who never made more than $60,000 a year, and nobody believed in her idea until now, it will be revolutionary, because for every problem we can attach the Lego into it, and maybe we can tackle a huge array of illnesses that they will be. This is from the scientific point of view, but religion, religion and reason, they don't go hand to hand, okay? So we always will have that. I'm a believer, okay? But when it comes to science, I'm more a scientist. And I think that if we were not afraid with the yellow fever, why are we so obsessed now with the end of the world? 100 years ago, people fought for the Spanish flu to be over, and nobody thought it was the end of the war. And when the plague in the 1300s that Dr. Cornejo mentioned, if you go to the city of Venice, there is a beautiful basilica. It's called the Santa Salud. What it means is when the plague was over, everybody built that church to thank God that the plague was over. So, and then, so I think science, and this is why we cannot lose our eye on wisdom. It doesn't mean that reason and faith are incompatible, but sometimes going back to the past, we can learn how to trust what is going on now. So I don't know if that can help you. I'm a science fanatic, okay? So, and the yellow fever, I'm from South America, I don't need it. But when my kids wanted to go to Bolivia, all of them had to get inoculated by the yellow fever. So, and we were glad. And if I want to go to teach to India for BC, I will have to get, I don't know how many vaccines. And it will never cross my mind that God will, if I believe that God exists and is a good God, all powerful, will never permit something so horrible to happen.
And that's where, yeah, we're going off into religion, and I could stay here forever as long as you're talking about religion, because my religion tells me that nothing bad comes from God. So I know that this disease, this COVID-19, is from the devil himself. Now, you mentioned yellow fever. We do not need to take the yellow fever vaccine to stay in the world. Right now, yellow fever is required for people who are traveling to places where the yellow fever is endemic. And other things too. For example, if you go to some African countries, malaria is endemic, so they want us to be immunized if we are going there. But this COVID-19 and these vaccines have the potential for everyone needing to get the vaccine, even to cross state lines. And that's what I'm afraid of. And then I'm afraid again of the fact that there is some bits of RNA that is in the vaccine. I don't know if it's in all of them or if it is in some of them. And my small knowledge tells me that RNA coming into someone's body is capable of changing that person's DNA. And if I am correct also, there are no other vaccines that have RNA in it. And then again to the luciferase, which comes from Lucifer, who was the angel of light in heaven and the minister of music, until he got so bold that God kicked him out, and now we know him as Satan and the devil. So am I putting luciferase, luciferin in my body? Those two words, the luciferin and the luciferase, they make me so frightened. And yes, scientific and science-minded, but all wisdom comes from God. All wisdom comes from God. There is nothing on this earth, because God is omnipotent and he's omniscient. There is nothing on this earth that is going to take my God by surprise. He knows everything. And some things he allows because sometimes we people need to learn a lesson. I don't know what the lesson is behind COVID, but like I said, all wisdom comes from God, and God in his wisdom knows why he allowed COVID to be on this earth.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to I'm gonna have to go to another meeting. I'm glad that y'all had such an interesting talk afterwards and that it created so much interest. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go, and I think it's gonna end the whole session. So I just wanted to thank you again, everybody, and yeah, have a great weekend. Bye.